Hello, you who have felt the weight of a choice. The story is one of the first we ever learn. It is simple: a garden, a man and a woman, a single tree, and a clear command from God: do not eat the fruit. For centuries, we have been told this was a straightforward test of obedience, a cosmic loyalty quiz. But what if that entire framework, the foundation of everything we believe about sin and the fall, is a profound misunderstanding? What if it was never a test at all? If you suspect the simplest stories hold the deepest secrets, this community is for you. Subscribe now, because we are about to re-examine the one command that changed human history forever. Let us look at it not as a divine decree, but as a family conversation. God is not a distant king, he is a father. Imagine a loving parent in a home they built for their child. The parent points to a glowing red-hot stove and says with desperation in their voice, "You must not touch that." Is that a test of loyalty? Is the parent setting a trap to see if the child will obey? Of course not. It is a warning, a desperate, loving plea born from superior knowledge. The parent understands the searing agony of a burn. The child, in their innocence, sees only a fascinating, warm object. The command is not about power, it is about protection. It is an act of mercy. Now let us walk back into the Garden of Eden with that image in our minds. See God not as a cosmic lawmaker, but as that protective parent. He points to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and says, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." This was not a threat of execution. It was a diagnosis, a statement of fact. He was not saying, "If you disobey me, I will be forced to kill you." He was saying, "If you consume this, something inside you will break. The peace you now experience, the innocence that defines your very existence, it will die." The command was an act of profound, almost desperate love. He was trying to shield his children from a psychological burden their minds were simply not designed to carry. He knew what the knowledge of good and evil truly was. It was not a superpower. It was not enlightenment. It was a curse. It was a form of consciousness that would instantly shatter their perfect, simple communion with him, with each other, and with themselves. He was trying to protect their sanity. He was trying to preserve their peace. This was not a game with an arbitrary rule. It was a quarantine zone. A line had been drawn around a source of immense spiritual and psychological poison. The story, we were told, was about a God testing for perfect obedience. But the real story, the one hidden in plain sight, is about a father protecting his children from a knowledge that would ruin them. He was trying to save them from a reality that would transform their paradise into a prison of their own making, a prison of anxiety, shame, and self-judgment. And the serpent, that ancient, subtle creature, he knew this. He understood God's motivation perfectly. And that is precisely why his most brilliant, most devastating lie was to tell Adam and Eve the literal, absolute truth. He promised them their eyes would be opened. He promised they would be like God. And he was right. What he offered them was exactly what they were about to get. The serpent is described as the most subtle, the most crafty of all the creatures in the field. His attack was not a frontal assault of lies. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He did not say, "God is lying to you." He did something far more brilliant and far more devastating. He planted a seed of doubt by asking a simple question: did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? It is a slight exaggeration, designed to make God's one restriction sound unreasonable. And then he delivered the masterstroke, a promise that was entirely true. He said, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Let us break that down. Was that a lie? No, it was the absolute literal truth, and that is what made it so venomous. Their eyes would be opened. They would be like God in one specific, terrible way. They would gain the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent's genius was not in the lie he told, but in the consequences he deliberately omitted. He offered them a promotion they were not qualified for. It is like handing a child the keys to a nuclear submarine and saying, "Now you will have the power of a commander." The statement is technically true, but the result will be catastrophic. The serpent was offering them the function of God, without the nature of God. He offered them the burden of divine judgment, without the capacity of divine wisdom and love to carry it. He was promising them godhood, but delivering them the anxiety of playing God. Think about the sheer genius of this temptation. It appeals to our deepest desires for power, for knowledge, for control. The serpent was selling them the throne of their own lives. He was telling them they no longer needed to trust the gardener. They could become their own gardeners. They could decide for themselves what was right and wrong. They could be the source of their own truth. This is the oldest and most compelling sales pitch in human history. You can be in control. You can be the master of your own destiny. And it was, in a sense, true. They were about to take control, but they were trading a universe of peaceful trust for a pinhead of anxious control. What does it mean to be like God, knowing good and evil? For God, this knowledge is not a burden. He is the standard. He is pure goodness. But for a human, a created being, to possess this knowledge is to be cursed with a new, terrible faculty, the power of constant comparison. Before the fruit, there was only is. After the fruit, there would be is and should be. And in the gap between those two things, all human misery is born. The serpent knew this. He knew he was not offering them a crown. He was offering them a crushing weight. He was tricking them into poisoning themselves. And to fully understand the devastation of that poison, we must first understand the perfect peace it was about to destroy. We must go back to the moment before the bite, to a state of consciousness we can barely imagine, a state of pure innocence. To understand the curse, you must first understand the paradise they were about to lose, and it was not a paradise of place, but a paradise of the mind. The most valuable thing they were about to give away was a reality without a single shadow. To truly grasp the tragedy of the fall, we must first try to imagine the world before it. Not just the physical garden, but the psychological landscape of Adam and Eve. What did it feel like to be them? This is the key that unlocks the entire story. They existed in a state we might call a consciousness of innocence. This does not mean they were ignorant or unintelligent. It means they lived in a state of pure being, without the filter of self-evaluation. They simply were. They did not have an inner monologue asking, "Am I good enough?" Think about that for a second. Imagine a life without an inner critic, a life without comparison. They walked with God in the cool of the day, not as servants trying to please a master, but as children enjoying their father, without a single thought about whether they were worthy of that walk. They were naked, and they felt no shame. Why? Because the concept of shame did not exist. Shame is not about nudity. It is about the fear of being seen as flawed. It requires a judge. In their world, there was no judge, not in God, and not in themselves. They did not know they were good. They simply were good. They did not know they were innocent. They simply were innocent. Their goodness was as natural and unthinking as breathing. A fish does not know it is wet. It is simply in its element. Adam and Eve were in their element. Their world was a world of direct experience. They saw a tree and experienced its reality, its beauty, its purpose. They did not see a tree and think, "Is this a good tree or a bad tree? Is it better than the tree next to it? How can I use this tree to my advantage?" That entire layer of judgment, of analysis, of categorization based on self-interest was completely absent. This is a state of mind that spiritual traditions throughout history have tried to return to through meditation and prayer, a state of pure presence. This was their default setting. There was no anxiety about the future. There was no regret about the past. There was only the present moment, lived in perfect communion with their Creator and their surroundings. It was a life without the friction of a divided mind. There was no gap between who they were and who they thought they should be. This is the paradise that was truly lost. Not just a geographical location, but a state of being. The command not to eat the fruit was a command to preserve this state. God was saying, "Stay here. Stay in this place of simple, trusting being. Do not take upon yourself the crushing weight of knowing." He was protecting their peace, a peace so profound we can barely comprehend it. We who live in a world of constant noise, both internal and external, we who are relentlessly judging ourselves, others, and our circumstances. We are the children of the fall. And our constant nagging anxiety is the echo of that first bite. They were on the verge of trading this silent, peaceful mind for a mind that would never again be quiet. They were about to eat the fruit, and in doing so, they would not gain a new power. They would give birth to a new voice inside their own heads, a voice that would haunt them and their descendants forever. This voice would become their constant companion, their accuser, and their judge. This is the moment the inner critic was born into the human experience. The bite, the single most consequential act in human history. The Bible describes what happened next with terrifying simplicity. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Let us not rush past those words. This is the moment the world broke. Their eyes were opened. But what did they see? Did they see a new dimension? Divine secrets? No. The very first thing they saw with their new knowledge was not the glory of God. It was their own perceived inadequacy. The first act of godlike judgment was turned inward, on themselves. They knew that they were naked. Just moments before, this was a simple fact of their existence, as unremarkable as breathing. Now it was a source of profound shame. The fruit had not changed their bodies. It had changed their minds. It had installed a new operating system based on judgment. For the first time, they looked at themselves and at each other, not with simple acceptance, but with a critical eye. They saw not just a body, but a flawed body, an exposed body, a vulnerable body. And their immediate instinctual reaction was to cover it up, to hide. This is the birth of the inner critic, that relentless, nagging voice in your head that points out your every flaw, the voice that compares you to others, the voice that tells you that if people really knew you, they would reject you. That voice was born in this very moment. It is the voice of self-judgment, and it is a direct consequence of knowing good and evil, because as soon as you have a concept of good, you automatically create a concept of not good enough, and that voice inside will relentlessly measure you against that impossible standard. Think about the psychological horror of this moment. Imagine living your entire life in a state of perfect peace and self-acceptance, and then, in an instant, your own mind turns against you. Suddenly, you are your own worst enemy. The garden is the same, the animals are the same, God is the same, but they have been plunged into a private hell of their own making. A hell of self-awareness, self-consciousness, and self-condemnation. This is what the serpent promised them. This is what it feels like to be like God, but without the grace and love of God. It is the power of judgment without the power of mercy. They sewed fig leaves together. The first act of human technology was not to build a shelter or find food. It was to manage shame. It was to create a barrier, a mask, to hide their newly discovered flaws from each other and ultimately from God. This is a curse we all inherit. We spend our lives sewing our own fig leaves. We use clothes, careers, accomplishments, and relationships to cover up our own deep-seated feelings of nakedness and inadequacy. We are all hiding, constantly managing the image we present to the world. The peace of the garden was shattered, not by a lightning bolt from heaven, but by a whisper from within. The serpent did not need to destroy them. He simply taught them how to destroy themselves. He gave them the weapon of self-judgment, knowing they would use it relentlessly. And this new, terrifying inner world immediately changed their relationship with their Creator. The presence of God, which had been the source of all their joy and comfort, was about to become the source of their greatest fear. The gardener was coming, and for the first time they did not want to be found. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. This sound was once the highlight of their existence, the beautiful, familiar signal that their Father was coming to walk with them. It was a sound of communion, of love, of perfect belonging. But now, poisoned by the fruit of self-judgment, they heard the same sound with new ears. It was no longer the sound of a loving Father. It was the sound of an approaching judge. The voice that was once a comfort was now a threat. And what was their reaction? Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. This is perhaps the most tragic sentence in the entire Bible. The first consequence of knowing good and evil was not enlightenment, it was alienation. They hid. Why did they hide? Because for the first time they were projecting their own newfound self-judgment onto God. They assumed he would see them with the same critical, shaming eyes with which they now saw themselves. They did not hide from what God was. They hid from what they imagined him to be. They were no longer living in a relationship of trust. They were living in a new reality of fear based on their own performance. Their inner critic was whispering, "You are flawed, you are naked, you are unacceptable." And they believed that God's voice would say the same thing. Have you ever done that? Have you ever felt a mistake so deeply, a shame so profound, that you pulled away from the very people or the very God who could offer you grace? This is the human condition in its rawest form, hiding our brokenness from the only one who can make us whole. Then God calls out, and his question is not an accusation. It is the heartbroken question of a father who has lost his children. Where are you? God, who knows everything, was not asking for a location. He was asking about their state. Where have you gone? Why are you no longer here with me? And Adam's reply is a confession that reveals the entire psychological breakdown. He says, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." Notice the chain of events. Hearing the voice led to fear. Fear came from his state of nakedness. Nakedness led him to hide. The communion was broken. The presence of God, once the source of life, was now associated with fear. This is the root of all human religion. We are the children of Adam, hiding among the trees, performing rituals and good works, hoping to make ourselves acceptable enough to come out of hiding. We are afraid of the one being who loves us most. Because we have eaten the fruit, we have taken on the role of judge. And living under the constant judgment of our own minds, we cannot imagine a reality where God does not judge us in the same way. The serpent's victory was complete. He had severed the connection of trusting love and replaced it with a relationship of fearful performance. He had turned children into orphans, hiding in a garden that was supposed to be their home. And this act of hiding is a curse we still live with. We are still hiding behind our successes, behind our social media profiles, behind our carefully constructed identities. We are all terrified of being truly seen because we are still carrying the impossible, crushing burden of being our own gods, a burden we were never meant to bear. The story of the garden is not a fable about a distant past. It is the operating manual for the human condition. The curse of the fruit was not a one-time event. It is a state of being that we are all born into. We are still living in the shadow of that tree, and we are still eating its fruit every single day. What is the knowledge of good and evil in a modern context? It is the endless, exhausting mental calculation of our own worth. It is the voice that says, "Did I do that right? What did they think of me? Am I a good parent, a good employee, a good person?" It is the crushing burden of being our own God, the responsibility of being our own judge, jury, and savior. We have to decide what is right, what is wrong, and then relentlessly measure ourselves against that shifting, impossible standard. This is the source of our collective anxiety. Think about the modern epidemics of burnout, anxiety, and depression. Are they not the direct result of this curse? We are trying to carry a weight we were never designed to carry, the weight of justifying our own existence, of proving our own worth moment by moment. Every time you compare yourself to someone on social media, you are eating the fruit. Every time you beat yourself up over a mistake, you are eating the fruit. Every time your worth is tied to your performance, your income, or your appearance, you are eating the fruit. The serpent promised a life of godlike knowledge. What we got was a life of unending anxiety. We were promised power, but we received a prison. The prison is our own mind, a courtroom where we are simultaneously the prosecutor, the defendant, and the judge, and the verdict is almost always guilty. This is the poison of the fruit. It makes us believe that our value is something we must achieve, rather than something that is inherent. It forces us into a life of constant striving, of hustle, of performance. We are trying to sew enough fig leaves to cover our perceived nakedness. And it is exhausting. This is why we are so tired. Not just physically tired, but spiritually and emotionally tired. We are bearing the divine burden of judgment, and it is crushing us. We were created for a life of simple, trusting being. Instead, we chose a life of complex, anxious knowing. God's command was an act of mercy. He was trying to save us from this. He knew that the moment we took on the mantle of knower, we would lose the peace of being known. The moment we became our own judge, we would lose the freedom of being his child. This is not a religious problem. This is the human problem. It affects everyone, regardless of belief. The gnawing feeling of not enough is the universal curse of the children of Adam. We have been trying to solve this problem on our own for thousands of years. We try to solve it with success, with therapy, with substances, with religion. But these are often just more sophisticated fig leaves. They are attempts to manage the symptoms of the curse, but they cannot cure the disease. The disease is that we believe we must be our own gods. But what if the antidote was not in trying harder, but in giving up? What if the solution was not in gaining more knowledge, but in surrendering the knowledge we were never meant to have? The path out of the prison begins with a radical act of trust. It begins by returning the burden. If the original problem, the core of the curse, was taking upon ourselves a burden we were not meant to carry, the burden of being our own judge, then the solution must be its perfect opposite. The only antidote to the poison of anxious knowing is the voluntary act of trusting. The way out of the prison is not to try harder to be a better god of your own life. It is to abdicate the throne. It is to willingly give the burden of judgment back to the only one who is qualified to carry it. This is the very essence of what the Bible calls faith. We often think of faith as believing a set of intellectual facts about God. But in this context, faith is not a thought, it is an action. It is the act of letting go. It is looking at the crushing weight of judging yourself, your past, and your future, and making a conscious decision to hand it over to God. It is a declaration of spiritual bankruptcy. It is saying, I am not qualified for this job. I cannot be the source of my own righteousness. I cannot measure my own worth. I am exhausted from trying. You must do it. This is the beginning of true spiritual freedom. Think of the relief in that surrender. Imagine the peace that comes from firing your own inner critic and trusting that the judgment of a perfectly loving God is infinitely more gracious than your own. His verdict is always grace, while our own is almost always condemnation. This is what it means to move from a relationship of performance to a relationship of trust. As long as you are the judge, you will always be hiding among the trees, terrified of being exposed. But the moment you allow God to be the judge, you are free to step out into the open. Why? Because you realize his judgment was already passed, not on you, but on the cross. He has already declared you acceptable, not because of what you have done, but because of who he is. Faith is simply choosing to believe that his opinion of you is more true than your own. This is not a call to ignorance or irresponsibility. It is a call to focus on your designated role. We were created for love, for creativity, for communion, for work. We were not created for self-justification. Our job is to walk. God's job is to judge the walk. We get into trouble when we try to do his job. Have you ever tried to rest while your mind is still racing, judging the day's events? True rest, true peace is impossible as long as you are on the throne. Peace is a byproduct of abdication. It is the silence that rushes in when the inner critic is finally told it is no longer in charge. This is the antidote. The fruit gave us the burden of knowing. Faith gives us the freedom of trusting. The fruit put a crushing weight on our shoulders. Faith is the act of letting that weight fall. It is a daily, sometimes hourly decision. When the voice of self-judgment rises up, faith is the act of saying, no, I'm not in charge of that anymore. I'm handing this over. It is a radical rebellion against the curse of the garden. It is the choice to stop eating the fruit. And when we make that choice, we begin to find our way back. Not to a physical garden, but to a spiritual reality. We begin the journey of walking out of the long, dark shadow of that ancient, terrible tree and into the light. We began this journey with a simple question about a forbidden fruit. We discovered it was not a test of obedience, but a desperate warning from a loving Father. A warning against a psychological poison that would change humanity forever. We saw how the serpent's brilliant lie was the literal truth, offering us a godlike power our minds were not designed to handle. We glimpsed the lost world of innocent consciousness, a paradise of the mind, free from the friction of self-judgment. Then we witnessed the birth of the inner critic, the catastrophic moment when our own minds became our own worst enemies, leading us to hide from the very presence of God in fear and shame. We realized that the curse of the fruit is the exhausting modern-day burden of being our own gods. And finally, we found the antidote, not in trying harder but in surrender. The radical act of faith of handing the burden of judgment back to God is the only path to true peace. So, what now? Where do we go from here? We are all born in the shadow of the tree, but we do not have to live there. The choice that Adam and Eve made in the garden is a choice that is presented to each of us every single day. Will you eat the fruit of anxious knowing, or will you choose the path of peaceful trusting? Will you spend your energy today trying to justify your own existence, measuring your worth and judging your every move? Or will you abdicate that impossible throne and allow yourself to be a child of a loving Father? The first path leads to exhaustion. The second leads to rest. Walking out of the shadow of the tree is a conscious choice. It is the choice to believe that you are unconditionally loved, not because you are perfect, but because He is. It is the choice to silence the inner critic with the louder, more gracious voice of your Creator. This is the journey from being your own God to being God's child. It is the path back to the garden, not as a place, but as a state of being. A state of walking with God in the cool of the day, with nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Thank you for walking this path of sacred psychology with me. If this exploration of the human condition has resonated with the deepest parts of your soul, please share your thoughts in the comments below. You are not alone in your search. Subscribe for more journeys into the heart of Scripture, and like this video if you are ready to lay down the burden and walk in freedom. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your presence here is a gift. Now, go forth and choose trust over knowing. Choose peace. Choose to walk out of the shadow